Hello everyone, welcome to a good old-fashioned shmup topic video. Today's subject is the sister or the twin
Twins, Basil, twins.
of another video that I have on this channel about gameplay density, and so I strongly recommend, if you want a better frame of reference to know exactly where I'm coming from, definitely check that video out, because this video builds on concepts that I lay out in my gameplay density video. And so what I want to do today is focus very specifically on level design when it comes to shmups and arcade games, because I've noticed across my various reviews, especially my more controversial R-Type Final 2 review, sometimes some of my criticisms don't seem to connect with certain members of the audience who may not be fully understanding exactly where I'm coming from, or they may seem like I'm just being elitist or hypercritical. And while that may be somewhat true, I also want to do my best to at least try to explain my elitism, hypercriticism to people out there, because I think it can be useful, not only for if you're going to be playing shmups and evaluating them, but also if you're thinking about getting into designing shmups or designing arcade games. I think some of these concepts that I lay out in this video could be pretty helpful. So where I want to begin is with the idea that I come across a lot when it comes to game design, where games are either linear or non-linear. And while I think this is useful in some discussions, I don't know if I fully buy into this model of linear versus non-linear. What I always think about is the criticism of this Final Fantasy game that came out quite a while ago called, I think it was Final Fantasy 13. I don't know. I'm not a huge RPG fan, but I do follow RPG discussion because a lot of it does revolve around game design discussion, which I think is more interesting than the games themselves. But I remember the main critique a lot of people had of this game is that it was too linear. Is that the creators of Final Fantasy 13 basically made hallways, and the players just had to run through the hallways and fight people, and that was most of the game. At least that's what I've heard. I'm not here to defend or criticize Final Fantasy 13, but the discussion around it. And I remember listening to some of these criticisms of the game, some of these discussions, and thinking to myself, I don't know if I fully buy this criticism, even if it's 100% true. Even if literally the game is, you start at X, you run through a hallway, and the game ends at Y, and that's all that happens, just X to Y. Even if that's 100% true and you just have to hold forward the entire time, or whatever it is, the idea of the game being linear wasn't exactly the problem. The problem likely was that the game was not providing you with incentive and rewards and fun things to do as you're running directly down that hall, because if the game had enough going on and had enough interest either in the combat system or whatever else is good in RPGs, the leveling system, and maybe the story is just awesome as you run through the hall, I don't know what, but as long as the other elements were very strong, I don't think the fact that you're going in a direct line really matters all that much. And the problem with this idea of non-linear game design being great is I also find it as sometimes just as a handy excuse at times, where people say things like, oh, it's player agency, when really they're just not thinking through their game design all that well. For example, you make a bunch of weapons in a game and most of them are basically useless. You can say, well, it's player agency for the player to have all these different weapons. Or maybe you add a bunch of different rooms or areas to a game that are basically void and pointless. There's not really much going on there, and there's not a lot to really motivate the player to do anything. But you could say, well, it's more player agency. You see, there's more things the player could choose to do if the player wanted to do them. The problem is this idea starts to break down as well. And the linear idea also breaks down. So an example I always think of is, a lot of people would probably say that Super Mario Bros., on the Nintendo and everything, is a linear game, because in many cases you literally are running across in a direct line from X to Y. Problem is, sometimes you get a few branching paths in there, like the vines and all that good stuff. You could say, well, that's a little less linear, but the game's still linear because ultimately it's not the player's agency to decide where to go because of the timers. This all gets very muddy is what I'm saying. The problem is you could do that the other way around, where you can make an open world game with all these different areas, all these different levels. You could just go anywhere, you could do anything, you could be whoever you want to be, until you include a purpose, until you include a goal. Then all of that starts to go away. Example, speedrunning. So let's say you have this big open world game, Breath of the Wild or something like that, but you introduce the goal of completing the game as fast as possible. You include a purpose, you include a goal. The player agency, so to say, starts to fade away very quickly, because very quickly you will probably establish, no, this is the optimal route. This is the correct route. This route is better than the other routes objectively, because the objective is to get to the end of the game very quickly. So that's the thing about non-linear game design I start to wonder is, well, how non-linear is it, or is it just aimless? You know, this is a larger discussion, but what I'm getting at here is I think people tend to think of these things as virtues and not. So linear game design is not that great. Non-linear game design is beautiful and wonderful and full of player agency, and it's creative and it's modern and it's wow and it's amazing, and let's make everything open world and non-linear. You all know I'm not a big fan of that. But the problem is that when you look at shmups and you look at them through this viewwork of them being linear games, this actually presents as a big problem, because when I think about shmups and when I think about arcade games specifically, I never look at them as linear experiences. Instead, what I like to view them as more as circular, or, because it sounds cooler, infinite level design, where instead of it having being you begin at X, the game ends at Y, the game isn't like that. It's more like a record that loops, that repeats itself, like Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, one of my favorite albums, where each track literally leads into the next track, and then the end of the album loops back into the beginning. And so if you put Marvin Gaye's What's Going On loop, it becomes an endless song where the beginning is the end is beginning, where's the middle, what track is what? And I think shmups are actually a lot like this, arcade games are a lot like this. And if you view them through this lens, there's certain game design decisions that start to make a lot more sense than others. So the perfect example of this is Dodonpachi Stage 1. And for those who know my channel, Dodonpachi is my favorite game of all time. And I've always said the biggest flaw with Dodonpachi by far is the inclusion of Stage 1. If I had my way, there would be a director's cut where Stage 1 disappears. You just begin on Stage 2. And the problem with Stage 1 is that at the time, its design made 100% sense. The idea behind Dodonpachi Stage 1 is to teach the player how the chaining system of the game works. It's a tutorial stage of this is how chaining works. And the problem is, once you understand the tutorial, you understand the tutorial. So it's really useful the first time you play, or the second time you play, but the third, the fourth, the fifth, the 100th, the 1000th, the 200,000th, and when it comes to shmups and arcade games, what makes them different than a lot of the, linear RPGs or whatever games you want to call them, is that they are not meant to be played once, twice, 10 times. They're meant to be played hundreds of thousands of times. I wouldn't say millions, because that's a lot, but at least hundreds of thousands of times across a lifetime if you're a really, really good player. Who knows how many times WTN has played Dodonpachi? I would reckon in the 100,000 territory to get the world record. And so if you look at the game like the CD that loops, certain game design decisions start to become a problem. For instance, tutorial stage 1s. Tutorial stage 1s in sort of modern game design perspective make sense. They are a good idea. And I've had these arguments with people before about this issue of, well, if you look at Super Metroid, if you look at these other games, there's videos about this, how ingenious they are because they have these little tutorial sections, but you don't know they're tutorials. It's like, yes, that's very clever. The problem is that when you put that framework into an arcade game, you start to run into this issue of, okay, what if the player already knows? So you're gonna force them to do a tutorial stage every single time they play. It basically becomes a loading screen. I remember Bananamatic said this about White Label, and it's kind of true. He's being a little over the top about White Label, but the first loop of White Label, for those who do not know, wipes away all your extends. So when you go into the second loop of White Label, Dodonpachi, DOJ White Label to be specific, it wipes away all your lives and you end up in the second loop and you have to re-earn your lives. The thing about it is though, you still have your scoring in stage, but the idea kind of makes sense. And this is probably why, ultimately, another reason why Black Label is probably better than White Label is because the first loop matters more than in the previous version. But with Dodonpachi, what they ended up doing, and this sort of, I think, validates my idea, is in DOJ, the sequel to Dodonpachi, they removed stage 1. There is no stage 1 in Dodonpachi DOJ. Well, there is, not in the reference of Dodonpachi. That Dodonpachi stage 1 tutorial stage, gone in its sequel DOJ. Instead, DOJ opens up with maybe like a 30-second tutorial section. Like, you get 30 seconds to learn how to chain the game, and then from there, you're playing now. You're playing for real, like you do in stage 2 in Dodonpachi. And I think this is a much smarter game design decision that they made in the sequel. And so this is something that is the perfect example of this concept of infinitely looping playthroughs, where if you start to add in tracks that don't make sense, you add in space that it works once. You add, let's say you add this nice cinematic section, right, in the middle of your game. It's like, oh, or like this very sort of QTE style section in the middle of your game. Hey, the first time you play it, that's kind of cool. The second time you play it, yeah, that's kind of cool. The third time you play it, okay, it's getting a little boring. Fifth, sixth, you can see this problem. It compounds upon itself. And so what I always think of whenever I'm thinking about shmup game design, and whenever I'm reviewing shmups and their level design, I think every second stretches into infinity. Every second compounds upon itself. A second is not a second. A second is an hour. A second is a year. Every second literally counts because the game repeats upon itself over and over and over again. So if you're doing 100 runs and you have 10 seconds of an empty screen, like let's add this flashy section where it's like a little cutscene and it's 10 seconds long, but it adds, dynamic and visuals and all that good stuff. Yeah, that makes sense with the linear idea of let's go through the game one time and add in all these fun little experiences the one or two times you play. But it doesn't make sense if it's the looping idea, because now if you compound that across 100 runs, I'm not gonna do the math, but you're gonna add minutes to hours of extra time of the player just sitting there like, This is actually something that when I'm developing my shmup, I need to get back to it because I accidentally deleted it and I need to redo it. But this is a concept that I actually would be really interested in pushing, where if you made a shmup that literally had zero downtime, what that would be like. Because all shmups have little bits of breaks, and that makes sense, and that's fine. But you have to be laser precise, in my opinion, with how those breaks occur, when they occur, why they occur. You have to justify every single second of the game. Because if you don't, you start to get bloat that compounds upon itself, and it starts to punish the players because they're sitting around. Like in stage 1 Donpachi, it's a loading screen. Sure, you can do a little bit more optimal chaining here and there, but at some point it gets to be, all right, we get it. Let's move on to stage 2 now, where the game actually begins. This is a problem when it comes to shmups, and I remember in my interview with the Exa CEO, for those who do not know, Exa is an arcade platform in Japan, a new one. He was saying one of the big problems with bringing over indie shmups or shmups that were more developed for home consoles or Steam is that some of the developers didn't quite understand this idea when it comes to arcade design. Because in the arcade, this idea is natural, because you want to move the player through the experience fairly swiftly to get them on and off the cabinet to make money. And it also needs to be infinitely repeatable because you want them to continue playing the same game over and over and over again. If they have what we have now, where you have all these different novelties and, oh, it's cute, oh, the story's great, but there's all this fluff in the game design, that's not going to hold up in the arcade, because once you play once, you've played it once. And so that's another reason why having ultra tight level design in shmups for me is incredibly important. And while I've continued to be such a hound on this issue, where if you make a shmup and I review it and you've got 10 seconds of me floating around, I'm going to be like, hey, this is a problem. If you have these sequences that repeat over and over and over that don't hold up over repeated playthrough, that becomes a problem. So that is the idea of this video, that I hope will be helpful to people to understand the way I look at shmups and the way I look at level design within the games, where it cannot be X to Y linear. It needs to be infinitely looping, repeatable. Every second needs to count, and if the second doesn't count, that's a problem. And that's where gameplay density works in. It needs to be very dense and rich in the game design. And so when you get everything put together with really rich, deep gameplay, and then you have airtight level design, that's where you get a great shmup. That's where you get a Grega. That's where you get a Donpachi DOJ. And Donpachi, if they remove stage 1, that's where you get these really strong shmupping experiences. And people sometimes wonder, oh, what makes one shmup better than another shmup? In my mind, this is one of the main tests, is how infinitely loopable is your game? How much does your game value the player's time, not just the other way around? And so thanks so much. Please like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thanks, everyone. So thank you to the $5 patrons: 72 PCT Water, Adam Pearson, Ukshay Wadker, Dingo, Andy Cap, Another Joe, Anthony A, Aaron Solis, Ben, Borgie22, Brian Reboot, Brian Shiver, Chris Yuzefovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Choreo, CRC Error, Danielle Savage, Darren Griffin, Delta Tango 6, Disco Star Slayer, Eric H, Frank Carter, Full Set, Roger Schmupper, Geriatric, Donmaku, Hausu, Ilya, Kiwi, JLab, JBRPG, Joe Angelo, John Kelly, Gameboy Guru, K, K2, Kikoman589, Larridge, Malaise, Mark Toms, Maz, Minung, Mechalin, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Philip Mason, Portal 63, Raul, Real Skeen, Sketchy Raccoon, SLW, The Boot Rex, The Real Ikuzo, TRM, Sugumo, Yishi, Plasmo, and Utsukaya. Thanks for watching.